Hello, everyone. I'm Carol Fleck, and on behalf of the ADDitude team, I'm pleased to welcome you to today's ADHD Experts presentation titled Co-Parenting After Divorce, How to Manage ADHD Consistently Across Households. Leading today's presentation is Merriam Sarcia Saunders. Merriam is a licensed marriage and family therapist, a certified clinical trauma professional, and an ADHD certified clinical services provider specializing in parenting and neurodevelopmental disorders. She is also an author, a graduate professor of psychology at Dominican University, and the founder of the popular Facebook page, How to Parent ADHD. In today's webinar, we'll discuss how divorced partners can work together effectively across separate households to raise their child with ADHD. Medication issues, heightened emotions, adjusting to new routines, and different parenting approaches are among the many factors that can complicate a post-divorce co-parenting arrangement. Our expert will provide strategies that will help both partners work together to set and maintain rules and schedules and find common ground to serve their child's best interests. We'd like to begin today's webinar by asking this poll question to our live audience. What are your biggest challenges when it comes to co-parenting a child with ADHD across households? Please select your answers and comment in the text box under the video player to tell us more. For answers to common webinar questions about slides, transcripts, and certificates of attendance, click on the FAQ tab of your webinar screen. If you're listening in replay or podcast mode, visit ADDitudemag.com and search podcast 466 to access the webinar resources. And if you support the work we're doing here at ADDitude to strengthen the ADHD community, we encourage you to visit ADDitudemag.com/subscribe and sign up for ADDitude magazine. The latest fall issue features a special Success at School section for caregivers and a Success at Work section for adults. Subscribe to ADDitude magazine for yourself or to share with a teacher or a loved one who could benefit from greater ADHD understanding. Click the magazine tab on your screen to learn more. Finally, the sponsor of this webinar is Excentrate. Excentrate is a dietary supplement formulated to address nutritional deficiencies known to be associated with ADHD. It contains omega-3 fatty acids in phospholipid form, the form already in the brain. The brain-ready nutrition helps manage inattention, lack of focus, emotional dysregulation, and hyperactivity without drug-like side effects. Click the link on screen or visit phoenixhealthscience.com/shop to learn more. ADDitude thanks our sponsors for supporting our webinars. Sponsorship has no influence on speaker selection or webinar content. So without further ado, I'm so pleased to welcome Merriam Sarcia Saunders. Thank you so much for joining us today and for leading this discussion.
Thank you, Carol. I am honored to be here today to talk about this very big topic. I hope that I'm going to be able to do it justice. I think I'm just going to be scratching the surface of a lot of issues that the audience is probably dealing with. But first, I want to explain that in addition to the bio that Carol read to you with all my clinical background, more importantly, I am also you. I am a parent of 3 neurodivergent children with ADHD and autism, and I'm also a divorced mom. So I understand the challenges of shepherding these beings through challenging ADHD symptoms and through the challenge of a changing family dynamic. But also, I am your child. I happen to have inattentive ADHD myself. My brother has the hyperactive kind. We weren't diagnosed as kids, of course, but we are also the children of divorce. And unfortunately, a really messy, ugly, they did everything wrong kind of divorce. So that is probably, one of the bigger reasons why this particular topic is a passion of mine, because I understand how important it is to bring the voice of the child to this topic most especially when they have unique needs. So let's start talking about it. So we already know that our children with ADHD come with a host of challenges in their life that have to do with executive functioning. And unfortunately, a divorce situation is going to introduce another risk factor into their lives, and it will heighten those executive functioning challenges, largely because now on top of a prefrontal cortex that already isn't doing, what it needs to be doing in the executive functioning category, it's now also trying to manage grief over the changing family dynamic, really intense emotions, frequent transitions when we already know that transitions are really difficult for children with ADHD. Now they're transitioning not only between home and school, but between home, school, and another home. This leads to a lot of changes in routine and also possibly witnessing parental conflict. Maybe potentially they were witnessing it already, and so now they're witnessing it less. But in a highly conflicted divorce, this witnessing the parental conflict can lead to behavior regression in skills that they had previously developed. We might be seeing increased defiance, increased lying, and increased arguing as a means of communication because that's what's being modeled for them. So in a perfect world, the gold standard for a great divorce when you have kids with ADHD would be that both parents are working together, there's very low conflict, and you bird nest. So for those of you who don't know what bird nesting is when the child stays in the main family home, and it's instead the parents who are going back and forth between either, one apartment that they share, or maybe they each have their own place to live. For really obvious reasons, this would be the ideal world for a child with ADHD because they're not the ones making these frequent transitions. They're not the ones having to keep track of, is that at parent one's house or parent two's house? I don't remember where I put it. They have one bedroom to manage, one home to manage. But this is also a really expensive option. In many cases, you're having to now maintain 3 homes instead of the 2. And also, there's a reason that you don't want to be living with this other parent. But when you're bird nesting, now you're coming back when it's your custody time to an arrangement where you're still seeing their dirty underwear on the floor, or their dishes in the sink, or their, shoes kicked off by the sofa. And you sharing the space is just a little too uncomfortable for the parents. So not a lot of people opt for this. And if they do, they don't opt for it long term. But gold standard divorce with ADHD would be bird nesting. Absent that, what you're shooting for is having the child's schedule mirrored in both homes. I'll talk a little bit more about this in a later slide. But hugely and most importantly is that both parents' approach to managing ADHD is the same, and it is a healthy approach. In terms of what a healthy approach is, that's a whole other talk, but ADDitude has a lot of great resources for you there if you need help with that. Also, I'll be talking a little bit later about the, using a family calendar and maintaining a flexible routine. Unfortunately, though, most of the time we're not seeing the gold standard divorce. Typically what happens is very often ADHD is ignored in one home, or it is not managed well in one home. Potentially each parent has their own schedule, their own set of rules. And because of this, it's very easy for the child to fall into the gap that happens between these two sets of schedules and rules. This can lead to academic challenges, constantly losing things. The child lives with this anxious feeling pretty frequently, and just the overall feeling that life is somewhat chaotic. And then, of course, this would lead to ADHD symptoms being even more difficult to manage. Okay, so clearly everybody would like option number one, right? And that's what we're going to be talking about today. So how do you get to option one? Now, if you are in a pre-divorce state, right, where it's imminent, you're working on it right now, I highly, highly recommend that you work with a mediator therapist as opposed to a mediator attorney to create a very extensive parenting plan that covers topics beyond just the custody schedule. What often happens in a divorce when you're working with attorneys is the only thing that gets talked about in terms of co-parenting is the custody schedule and maybe like who gets Christmas and who gets New Year's. But there are, a whole host of topics that go into the co-parenting relationship that, if they are addressed in the beginning and agreed upon, will eliminate the next 18 years worth of conflict of having to just, do it on the fly. And while it might be a little more challenging and potentially even a little more expensive to front load your process with creating this parenting plan, when I work with parents in a divorce situation, we come up with a 30-page document. And that's going to go over like what happens when we have long-term homework projects and what happens when we introduce a significant other to our child, what happens around extracurricular activities. I mean, we're diving into nearly everything so that there's a blueprint for the upcoming years. That gets filed with the courts. And so the other benefit to that is that if the other parent doesn't do what you agreed, you have recourse to go back to the courts and say, hey, we agreed to this and he or she isn't doing it. Now, if you're already divorced, I would recommend that you consider still writing that plan now. If you can get the co-parent to agree to sit down with you and hash it out, then you may not have to file it with the court, but at least it gives you both this blueprint that you can follow so that you can manage these situations as they come up. And then in the situation where your co-parent is just unwilling, I would consider drafting this plan on your own. Come up with your own blueprint, because these are all co-parenting issues, especially in terms of how to manage the ADHD, that are going to come up for you as you parent this child. And if you have your own plan, at least you will know that in your home, you have a blueprint and a roadmap for the way that you want to handle the conflict that might come around these topics. So that's my 2 cents on coming up with a parenting plan. So in terms of a custody schedule, in a what I'll call neurotypical divorce, we have recommendations for what the custody schedule should look like for, particular ages and stages of a child's life. And it goes something like, the younger the child, the more frequent contact you want to have with both parents. And so that will usually look like a frequent transition, maybe a midweek transition. So parent A will have Monday, Tuesday, drop the child off at school Wednesday morning. Parent B picks the child up Wednesday afternoon and has the Thursday, Fridays, and then they alternate weekends. It isn't until the child gets a little bit older, middle school and beyond, that we tend to recommend a week on, week off schedule, because they can go for longer stretches of time without seeing the other parent, because they've already formed those bonds and attachments with that other parent. Now, in a neurodivergent situation, that midweek transition might be a nightmare for your younger child. If you have a third or fourth grader who has to go to a different home every Wednesday, that might not be an ideal custody schedule for your child with ADHD for all of the reasons that you can imagine. They're having to remember all of the things that they have to bring from home to school and then bring them to another home. Things get lost. Homework projects get lost. There's just a lot of shuffling happening midweek. So your custody schedule, might really be built more on a let's see how this goes basis. And if you notice that your child's ADHD symptoms are worsening, or there's regression, there's increased defiance, for a period of like 6 months, then you might want to go back and look at your schedule and say, you know what, for the time being, until our child is a little bit older, midweek transitions might not be beneficial to them. And we might need them to be in one home for the school week with frequent access to the other parent, right? So maybe dinners 2 nights a week with the other parent. And again, these are sweeping generalizations. So it really just has to be on, what you notice for your child. You might have to be really flexible around things like long-term school projects, and just being very honest about which parent is going to be the better parent for helping with that particular project. And that maybe if there is a long-term project, the custody schedule might need to change to accommodate that, so that your child, so that everything's being scaffolded and their anxiety isn't being heightened. You want to be really careful about scheduling too many extracurricular activities during a period of adjustment to a new divorce, because, again, this is just a lot going on. The more you can quiet your life, at least while the child is getting used to the new situation, possibly the better. Now, flip that around. If your child is really used to going to, Little League baseball, and that's something that they've always been able to count on, then you want to make sure that that stays in their life, right? That's sort of a fixture that they can count on, that you would want to keep that. And then it's really, really important that you maintain what I call a flexible routine with the co-parent. So flexible routine is where you have a routine in place that's based on your child's needs, right? It's not a rigid routine like we always do this way, but it's based on what works for your family and your child. But that on the times and the moments that it doesn't work, you're okay with switching it up a little bit. So if, for example, your co-parent has a family reunion on Sunday, but that's your custody time, that you acknowledge that it's really beneficial for your child to also be with their other family. And so there's a flexibility around, like, yeah, of course, you can go with the other parent on that Sunday. And I'm not going to be really rigid about making sure I get my time back, because it's more about what is in the best interest of your child. In terms of scheduling, if your child has siblings that don't have an ADHD diagnosis, I've worked with families in the past that sometimes choose to have the non-ADHD sibling transition as per your custody schedule that you determined, but the ADHD sibling doesn't. So one sibling might stay in one home for the school week, but the other siblings go back and forth. And that might seem really strange and unusual to sort of break up the family, if you will. But sometimes it's actually really beneficial for the non-ADHD sibling to have time with one parent without the ADHD sibling present, because we all know that that is often a challenge, managing the attention that the non-ADHD sibling gets because their sibling with ADHD sometimes needs a lot more attention. And so that might be a consideration for your family as well. Okay, so how do we stay consistent across two homes? The first and easiest one, if you have a willing co-parent, is to try to have a very similar schedule. So, you know, our child, when they come home from school, it's snack time and some downtime, then homework, then TV. Bedtime's always at the same time in both homes, and it's relatively the same. So the child, even though they might be in a different home, they know the routine, and the routine is the same. You both have the same rules. You have the same reward system. You're talking to each other about the rewards that are happening. You're adhering to your parenting agreement, and you're having regular meetings about your child. This one's really challenging because a lot of times we don't like this other person. That's why we divorce them. I don't want to be meeting with them. But especially for, you know, healthily managing your child's ADHD, you just might have to have a monthly meeting or a biannual meeting where you're checking in with each other around making sure that you're consistently co-parenting. If a meeting is out of the question, then, you know, email check-ins or text check-ins that are kept very non-emotional and professional, just to make sure that you're keeping that consistency. And then you might also try to agree on transition routines and flexible transitions. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's say you transition Saturday mornings at 9 a.m. at the parking lot of Target. Well, you both know as this child's parent that getting this little bean out of bed in the mornings, especially on a Saturday, is next to impossible. And then getting them dressed and out the door is also next to impossible. So getting anywhere by 9 a.m. might be really challenging. And so potentially what you agree is, we're shooting for 9 a.m. We'll text when we're on our way out the door, so that parent B is not sitting in the parking lot of Target getting increasingly angry because you're late every single time. You know, but instead it's an understanding that ADHD might really be impacting our ability to get to that transition on time. And so we're going to be flexible about it. A lot of parents also have questions around how to make transitions easier for their children. One of the things that I like to recommend is that you establish a ritual around the transition, especially for younger children. What I mean by that is, for example, you know, your child knows that whenever parent A picks them up, parent A is going to greet them in the same way. You know, it's going to be a pat on the head and a kiss on the cheek and then a hug, and then we sing the same song, and then we read the same book, or we go to the same restaurant, or we get an ice cream at the same place, or whatever it is that the child can always count on. This is what happens when I transition to parent A. Parent B can have their own little ritual. It doesn't have to be the same ritual that parent A has, but if both parents have this sort of ritual that the child can count on, it can be very comforting. And then the use of a shared calendar, especially if you have a younger child, then I would recommend having a big visual representation of that calendar somewhere in your home, that with pictures of, you know, this is when you're at parent A's house, this is when you're at parent B's house, with colored stickies or little pictures of homes or whatever it is that helps your child visualize time. Kids with ADHD are very time challenged in really understanding a sense of time. And so having a visual representation of that time can often help to quell anxiety around, where am I going? What am I doing? When am I going there? I highly recommend, if you're not already doing so, that you adopt some type of digital organization tool or app that you both as co-parents share an account over and use as your way of communicating and of keeping a shared calendar. There are a ton of really great options out there. If you don't know what they are, I have a slide with my email address. Feel free to email me and I can send you a list of the ones that I recommend. We all know the dreaded backpack with kids with ADHD. It's like a black hole. So to the degree that you can have some type of organization routine that is mimicked by the other parent, that will also help with your child being able to keep track of their items. And it might extend from their backpack to their, duffel bag or whatever they take back and forth between homes. I highly recommend that you have, a wardrobe in your home and a wardrobe in the other home, and that you're really flexible about the clothes that go back and forth. I've mediated parents where they, it's the conflict is around, my mother bought a winter coat and it went to your house and I've never seen it again. Just recognizing that your children's clothing is their clothing. And even though your mother might have gotten them, a magic sweater that she crocheted, if it winds up in the other parent's home, it still belongs to your child and everything's okay. You might want to consider, if you don't use a digital app, to have something like a home-to-home folder that stays in the backpack, or a notebook where you communicate with the other parent, and it's or even a communication book where the child is invited to see what's written in there. So you have to, be somewhat mindful about what's written. You might want to consider, having laminated lists that go into the backpack, or color-coded tags. Again, ADDitude has really great resources if organization is a challenge, but really being mindful about the fact that your child is going back and forth, and keeping track of things is going to be an issue. So anything that you can do consistently with the other parent to keep track of those things for your child and scaffold that for as long as you can will be helpful for your child. Medications, you're going to have to determine whether you are the type of family that are able to have the medications travel back and forth with your children, or maybe you need to split them up and have a quantity available in both homes, because you don't want your child to be without their medication if they take it. And then if you're communicating with doctors, teachers, therapists, always CC the other parent. An informed co-parent is only going to be beneficial for your child. Okay, so here's my email address. If anybody wants to write it down, feel free to email me for that list of recommended apps. Okay, so what about if you are seeing an increase in challenging behavior? 3 that, kind of leap out that a lot of parents are concerned about are, the first is lying. So lying is an extremely common behavior with ADHD, especially younger children. Most of the time, the parents that I work with are always super concerned because they think, I'm raising a sociopath. Why is my child lying? This is not the kind of, family morals that we have. But the issue, especially with younger children, is they are desperately trying to undo something their brain made them do that they really didn't want to do. Okay, so they just did something impulsive before they had an opportunity to even consider whether they should do it or not. And now they've gone and done it, and they may have even surprised themselves, and they really wish they hadn't done it. And they know they're probably going to get in trouble for doing it. And so they hope that by saying it didn't happen or that they didn't do it, that they can somehow undo it. That maybe they'll have a shot at you believing them that they didn't do it. And so, no, you're not raising a sociopath. You're not raising a bad kid. It's almost the opposite, right? Because you're raising a kid who recognizes, yikes, I wish I hadn't done that. And I would really like to try to undo it by lying about it. Now, in the case of a divorce, lying can often take on a whole other dynamic. And that is that you may have a child who is lying about what is happening in the other home. And this may be because they think it's what you want to hear. They often feel as though they're at fault for the divorce, and they see that you're sad when they leave you. Maybe they're having a great time in the other house and they feel really bad that you're by yourself. So they might want to be conflating bad things that are happening in the other home to make you feel better. And so if they're lying about things that are like that are happening in the other home, take a deep breath before you freak out, because a lot of parents will wind up thinking like, oh my gosh, that other parent just can't take care of this kid. Like they are eating candy for dinner. They're going to bed at 2 a.m. When that really might not be happening, or it might not be happening to the degree that your child is representing. If you're getting divorced while your child is a teen, this can come with a whole host of its own. This could be its own webinar. But briefly, what's happening for your teen is this is the time of life when they are individuating from you, right? They're learning to become independent, be their own person, make their own decisions. And they're also exploring their own sexual relationships for potentially the first time. And so the divorce coming at this moment in their lives can often interfere with this developmental stage. And they are potentially now being rushed towards this sense of independence. They may also feel as though they have to caretake a parent who's struggling emotionally. If you're repartnering, the act of witnessing you or thinking about you being sexually intimate when that's what they're facing themselves can be a challenge for them. And so that on top of ADHD that may or may not have gone unmanaged to this point, can sometimes lead to acting out. So if that's what's happening for your child, parents of teens tend to freak out a lot because they don't recognize that this is a time when they should be stepping back, letting go of the scaffolding a little bit, and not being so fearful of letting their child fail a little bit, but that they also have to start transitioning from being what I call the CEO of their child's company and moving to the board of directors of that company. So if that is you, make sure that you're listening a lot. That's your biggest job, actually, is to listen and ask some questions, but don't talk at your teen so much. Don't prescribe and don't try to control so much. But the more you can be your child's advocate and ally rather than their adversary, the more likely your child won't wind up acting out. And then parental alienation. So parental alienation is essentially the concept of one parent creating an environment in which the child doesn't want to be with the other parent, either through, talking badly about the other parent or creating such a great situation in their home that the child doesn't want to go to the other parent. If this is happening in your family, with ADHD, parental alienation might not be what we think it is. Oftentimes, the child with ADHD will prefer one parent's home over the other because their ADHD is managed better in that home. Or the transitions are just too difficult, and it's just a lot easier for them to stay in one home. So if this is the case where your child is refusing to go to the other home, don't necessarily assume it's because bad things are happening in the other home. It could just be that your home is super great for them. And if your co-parent is willing to adjust custody schedule for the time being, then, again, that might be in the best interest of your child. Divorce, any kind of change in the family, it's going to come with some really big feelings. The best way to start to manage your child's big feeling is by owning your own. It's really good modeling. We can't hide what we're feeling from our kids. We might think that we can, but they are so in tune and they can sense it. So it's really okay for you to say, yeah, you know what? I'm feeling really sad right now, but it's okay. I'm not going to feel like this forever. It's going to pass, but today I feel sad, and that's okay. If they have trouble verbalizing and they're acting out their feelings instead, it might be helpful for you to name, pardon me, what you see. Excuse me. It might for you to name what you think you're seeing them feel, and to normalize those feelings for them. Like, yeah, you know what? This is really hard right now. Things are very different and you're moving around a lot, and I get it. And that's okay. It's okay for you to be sad right now. If verbalizing is a struggle and they're young, consider having them draw their feelings, make up songs about it, make up dances about it. You might want to watch movies or read stories that deal with loss, and then talk about what the characters are struggling with and whether your child identifies with that character and how they're managing their loss. Reassure your child and reassure them even when you think they don't need reassurance. They might be very quiet about it, but they probably, especially if they're younger, think that on some level they caused this to happen. And so you want to remind them over and over that this is not their fault. And that while a parent's love for each other might change and look different, a parent's love for their child never changes, and that will always stay, and you will always love them. As I mentioned with the teens, really listen. We have a tendency to go right into fix-it mode because we want our child to feel better. But sometimes the growth opportunity with them is not fixing, but just listening. Be aware of their tendency to want to caretake you and manage your own sadness. Find ways to help them soothe. Maybe they need the sensory box. If they stim, giving them room to stim, and then pay attention to regression and worsening signs, and know when maybe you need a higher level of care by, with therapy. Just a quick word about wording too is, to be sensitive about how you refer to the divorce, right? Your family is not getting divorced. Your child's family, regardless of whether it looks a little bit different and it's spread across two homes, your child's family is still their family. And constantly referring to it as the family can be very helpful for your child. I don't think we have time to talk about their diagnosis today, but if you are welcoming a new partner or step family into the situation, then you might want to ask that new partner to get up to speed on parenting an ADHD child. Have them take a parenting course. I have a great one. Read some books, talk to a therapist, and then with your co-parent, it would be really helpful if ahead of time you agree not only on timing and how to introduce significant others to your children, but also the degree to which a significant other may contribute to parenting, right? If you and the co-parent can agree on that, then that can avoid a lot of conflict if you have significant others who are attempting to also parent when it's unwelcome. Okay, so this is the really big, I think, hot button. How do I do all that? Because it sounds great, but how do we do it when the other parent won't get on board? So a really, really common scenario that I see in my practice is that there's one parent that in the course of the marriage and the upbringing of the children has sort of come to know, most everything about ADHD. They're the primary parent when it comes to managing the ADHD. They have, maybe a tightly managed household. Maybe there's even a little helicoptering happening, but that is sort of the ADHD go-to parent. Parent 2 maybe doesn't even believe in the diagnosis. Maybe they're more playful. They might be the type of parent that when they're around, they're upsetting the careful balance. Parent 1 during a divorce situation is really worried that parent 2 is not going to parent well and that their child may not thrive in parent 2's home. And no matter, what they do, they can't get parent 2 to agree to parent the way parent 1 wants to parent, especially in terms of managing the ADHD. And parent 1's anxiety spikes, and the child is very much aware of that. So I have good news and bad news for you here. Okay. If you are dealing with a co-parent who refuses to either get on board with ADHD or refuses to co-parent consistently, refuses to parent the way you parent, you have no control over that. And I am so sorry to tell you that I don't have a magic button to make that other parent come on board. It just doesn't exist. But I also have good news for you. And the good news is that in your home, you have all the control. So 50% of your child's life is going to be well managed as far as you're concerned. Whereas before the divorce, how the ADHD was managed might have been a constant battle, and your child had really kind of no opportunity to experience what it felt like to be in a home where their ADHD was well managed all of the time. Now, in a 50-50 custody schedule situation, 50% of the time, your child has the opportunity to understand what it feels like to have their ADHD well managed. And that is probably all they will need to thrive. They're going to go to the other parent's house, and it might be a debacle. It might be chaotic for them. But the reality is, in their life, they are going to face chaos. They're going to go to school. They're going to have a job. And it might be an unmanageable situation. And they are going to have to learn how to manage it. And so if you can sort of think about the time they spend in the other parent's home as this opportunity for them to experience an unmanageable situation and learn how to manage it, it may actually turn out to be a growth experience on a certain level for them. It's not ideal, I get it, but it isn't as bad as you might potentially be catastrophizing. Studies show that if a child has at least one stable, reliable parent and home, that they have just as much opportunity to grow into a fully functioning, well-adjusted adult, even one with ADHD. And when they become that adult, rest assured, they will look back on their childhood and they will know which parent had their back. They will know which parent offered them a healthy upbringing and managed their ADHD well and taught them what they needed to learn. So I offer you that, only in the sense of somehow at least relieving a little bit of your anxiety if that is your situation. So in terms of trying to get the other parent on board at least a little bit, you can lead the horse to water, right? And the water that you can offer this horse is send them the link to this webinar. Buy them my book. I have a book called Divorce and the ADHD Autistic Anxious Child that talks all about best practices and how to write a good parenting plan if you have a child with ADHD. suggest they take an ADHD parenting course. Send them articles that you read from ADDitude magazine. Make sure you include them in all communications, and keep them up to date with any ADHD-related struggles, with academics and extracurriculars, the ornery coach that your kid is working with. Keep them up to speed, even if they don't seem to be willing. Potentially request at least one therapist meeting with a therapist who specializes in ADHD. If they'll only go to one, maybe that will be the one that it'll take for them to understand how and why their child is different. And I think that's that. I think that's it. So this is, for more help, feel free to email me, but I'd love to take questions now.
Thank you, Merriam. Before we start the Q&A, I'd like to thank Accentrate once more for sponsoring this webinar. I'd also like to share the final results from today's poll question: what are your biggest challenges when it comes to co-parenting a child with ADHD across households? And here's what you said. 25% said working with an uncooperative co-parent, as you just mentioned. 18% each said communicating effectively and addressing behavior stemming from ADHD. 16% said setting limits around screen time. 10% said aligning on school or homework expectations, and 5% said managing medication. Okay, now to your questions. Based on what you just said, we have a question. My ex is in denial about our child's ADHD. Should I get my child to help influence that parent to provide them with meds and other support?
Okay. Oh, that's a great question. In general, I would say no, but that also depends on the age of your child. So the older your child, the more I would say your child should take ownership of advocating for themselves, and that advocacy might even be in terms of dealing with their other parent. A young child, though, a child who's elementary or younger, middle school age, that's a big burden to ask them to share. When cognitively they might not really be able to make that argument or express their need with the other parent. So, that's definitely age dependent.
Okay. Naturally, we had quite a few questions around different parenting styles, such as when one parent is more of a disciplinarian or even authoritative, and the other is permissive. And these different parenting approaches can be confusing to a child. How can parents come to an agreement on behavior management and issues, particularly surrounding homework?
Right. So, this is, first of all, if we're making the assumption that both parents want to come to a compromise, because that's a whole other issue. But if you have two parents that just have two different styles, but they really want to work together, then I would hope that you would be willing to talk very openly about what seems to be working, right? And use maybe some evidence from your child's life around, hey, it looks like our child responds much better when we approach it this way. Or it looks like this kind of homework support seems to be working, whereas this kind of homework support seems to be creating some anxiety. And so hopefully if you're open to talking about that in that way, then you can come to a compromise around, well, let's both try this, or let's both try that. I think chances are pretty slim in most cases that you have that kind of ability to agree. And so you might need a third party that advises you. And that might be a therapist, or even a really good teacher that you've been working with, or somebody like that who can maybe be an intermediary around those really challenging parenting problems.
Okay. We have a question around medication. My former partner wants to stop our child's ADHD medication on weekends, and I don't. This sends a mixed signal to our child. How can we handle this?
I would send you straight to your pediatrician. It's really important that that medication is given based on either the psychiatrist's or the pediatrician's recommendations. And so talking to the doctor about, is this okay that one parent doesn't do this, and the other parent does, and hopefully you both agreeing to follow whatever the doctor says you should be doing.
Okay. This question, co-parenting isn't a problem for us, but it is a struggle for our young kids to go from one house to another. They miss being away from one parent or the other parent. How can we handle this?
Again, depending on the age of your child, some children tend to get cell phones at a younger age if they come from divorced parents. I would very much recommend frequent contact. So I've worked with parents before where when the child is in their custody, they only allow their child to call the other parent twice a week. Or I think your child should have free access to talk to the other parent whenever they want and whenever they need. And if they're with you, they should be able to call the other parent at bedtime and say goodnight to them every single night that they're with you. The more that you normalize, hey, we just live in two homes, but there's not animosity, and I respect the fact that this is your other parent and you love them and you might want to talk to them every single day, and that's okay. So allow frequent contact, and then allow your child to talk about the other parent. A lot of children will think that they're not allowed to talk about their other parent with you because it's going to make you feel bad. Ask good questions about the other parent that makes it sound like you're interested, not prying for information. And compliment the other parent, or say, "Oh my gosh, you're laughing just like Daddy laughs right now," or you said that just like Mom says that. Really make it a safe space for your child to know that they can talk about the other parent in your home.
We had quite a few questions around favoritism. How can we prevent favoritism of a parent, especially when one parent allows unlimited screen time to perhaps win a child's love, or doesn't demand that the child do chores and other tasks? How can we work on that?
Yeah. So that's pretty common, even especially in any kind of a divorce situation. And I would say that while it might be challenging for you to tolerate potentially not being that favorited parent, that you have to continue to parent in the way that you feel is best for your child in your home. And if your child is going to push up against that, that's kind of your kid's job, right? Of course, they want unlimited screen time. I get to do that, in my other parents' home. But that's ultimately really not what's good for them. And even though it might be what your child is asking for, in the long run, your child, again, is going to reflect back when they're an adult and recognize, oh my gosh, my one parent just let me watch video games for 5 hours straight. That didn't feel very good. That wasn't very boundaried. That really wasn't what I needed. And so you being that maybe difficult disciplinarian, boundaried parent might be harder for you because you want to be the favorite parent, but it's ultimately not what's best for your child. So just remind yourself that that you are doing what's in the best interest of your child, and that ultimately they will see that.
We have one question. My child lies to both parents, which is easy to do when their parents don't communicate well. How do we keep the kids focused and accountable for school and chores?
Well, I would say, especially the part of that question that said when the parents don't communicate well, and I would maybe take a good hard look at what you're bringing to this dynamic, and potentially, rather than putting all of the responsibility on your child in the scenario, that potentially if you and the other parent could begin to communicate better, then there would be less of an opportunity for your child who has ADHD and is already challenged in the lying department and is a child. It puts less of the responsibility on them. Yes, of course, we want to raise children that don't lie, but the job number one is really for you and the other parent to start to communicate better so that it happens less. Okay. Probably not an answer you love to hear.
When you have a situation where minimal contact with the other parent is recommended to maintain peace, given high conflict and an unhealthy situation, what other guidance might you suggest here to help the children transition?
That's a challenging question, not knowing a little bit more of the dynamics to answer very generally. I'm not really sure what what's happening in the other home, whether it's an abusive situation, but let's say that's not at play. It's not any abuse that's happening. If the child is having minimal contact, then again, really giving them an opportunity to talk about that other parent, to grieve the lack of contact that they're having with the other parent, maybe to, draw pictures or have a memory box or a box where that has things that remind them of the other parent that they can go to so that they at least feel as though there's some sort of connection with the other parent. I'm not sure. Was the question more about transitioning to the parent they've had minimal contact with?
That was all. I'm not sure. That was all the question, the entirety of the question.
Okay, but also depending on the age of the child, they might really need a good amount of lead time before transitions, right? So if you have this visual calendar, you can be reminding them like, okay, right, tomorrow is the day you go to your other parent's house, and maybe giving them opportunities to talk about it, like what's it going to be like, so that it's not such a shock for them when it happens.
We have this question around step parents. Do you think step parents should be looped in on all of your advice, on emails, on being the parent who's helping with long-term projects, etc.?
I do think that step parents very much need to be up to speed on healthy ADHD parenting, so that they're not part of the problem. Whether they're involved in the parenting is something that I think you and the co-parent should agree on ahead of time, so that the step parent's not stepping on any toes. And to what degree do they have decision-making ability within the home? It's tricky, if you're married to this other person, if they have kids too, and parenting is fluid and dynamic. It doesn't happen in isolation, right? It's really hard to say, I'm going to parent these 3 kids, but not this one. What's most important is that there's agreement. Everybody's on board. We're doing it the same way. We're all up to speed.
One mom writes, I actually don't feel like I have all the control in my own home, because when my 16-year-old doesn't like something or disagrees with me, he just walks out and goes to his dad's, and dad won't make him come back. Any suggestions?
Yeah, that's a good point. Again, unfortunately, all I can say is that you have to stick to parenting the way that you feel is most healthy for your child. And if your child has the ability to get up and walk out the door and the other parent isn't cooperative with you, there's not much you can do except maybe to get to a point where you can have an honest conversation with your teen around their experience in that moment. Are you really listening, or are you trying to control maybe beyond what your teen needs or wants in that moment? Are there some compromises you can come to with your teen. Is this just your teen really trying to exercise a very normal part of their development, which is to individuate and become more independent, and there's too much helicoptering going on? Is there some independence you can give your teen in your home so that they don't feel like they want to leave all the time? So, maybe have a more collaborative discussion with your teen and really, really listen to what's going on for them.
Well, unfortunately, that has to be the last question. And Merriam, thank you so much for joining us today and for contributing your expertise to our ADHD community. We appreciate it very much.
Thank you very much for having me, and hope I was helpful.
You were super helpful. And thanks to today's listeners. We hope to see you again next week for our free webinar on helping twice exceptional students cope with stress and avoid burnout. And make sure you don't miss future ADDitude webinars, articles, or research updates by signing up to receive our free email newsletters at attitudemag.com/newsletters. Thank you, everyone.